The entire purpose of living in a fucking European social democracy is like relegating the responsibility of empire to the United States of America, where all of us fat fucking pigs are dying here because we can't have social safety nets because we're spending all of our money on fucking destroying the global south. Stop trying to be America. You are not him. Speaking of strikes, obviously France's pension reform is continuing. New day of strike action planned for Tuesday.
More on those talks today, though. Let's bring in France 20.
One of the most confusing aspects of this French protest movement is that, like, Frenchmen protest all the time, okay? It's like a bit of a meme at this point, even though, you know, more power to them. It's great. I love it. Wonderful. One thing that I do find really strange is that, like, the American media rarely ever covers this shit. Like, the BBC covers Germany, France, obviously from the perspective of the governments and against the interest of labor. But it's odd that America rarely ever covers what is going on in France and the protests in France. I wonder what the reason for that is.
24 senior reporter Catherine Norris-Trent, who's at the Élysée Presidential Palace. Catherine, first of all, talk us through the focus of these meetings today. Are they just trying to find a way out?
Hi there, Jeannie. That's right. Emmanuel Macron is trying to forge a way forward because things are still at loggerheads here in France over this highly controversial pensions reform, which has now passed Parliament, albeit rammed through using that constitutional tool, the 49-3. And we saw the violence and the...
It's like the entire world is on fire. Israeli people are protesting the far-right government in Israel. People are protesting for pension reform in France, rioting in the fucking streets. People are rioting, not rioting, but doing general strikes in Germany for additional benefits and compensation. Meanwhile, in America, we're like, oh, what happened? Is there another mass shooter? Let's take a look at the mass shooting. Here's another mass shooter, and we will forget about it in approximately 12 and a half hours. At least British media covers it. American media hates labor movements so much they don't even care to report on it. I've talked about this before with respect to like British media and its coverage of labor movements versus America. I think in America, we don't even have labor beat reporters for the most part. Like, very rarely have they been utilized because labor has been so effectively dismantled. A lot of labor unions are basically a part of the Democratic Party's infrastructure in many respects, and they themselves will sometimes implement or advocate for neoliberal policies because they benefit from it. They think that it actually helps them with their insurance schemes. This is, of course, not the rank and file's interest. The rank and file's interest can sometimes deviate from the interest of the labor leaders, right? The labor union leaders sometimes, unfortunately, do not represent the interests of the labor union rank and file. So for that very reason, I think that America just doesn't have a lot of experience covering labor, so much so that, like, sometimes they might even come across as like pro-labor in many respects in the United States of America. Oftentimes, whenever they cover labor union action, they're not like super aggro against the union employees. And I think it's a matter of how little power labor unions have in comparison to, like, in the UK, where they have relentless, since Thatcher, and even before that, but definitely since Thatcher, relentless and endless amounts of coverage to labor unions being awful and bad for the economy and being selfish and lazy and not wanting to work hard and blah, 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 blah. Does that make sense? Legacy union leadership outside of the new TDU Teamster leadership, they are all business unionists. They don't give a fuck about the militant labor. They are indeed they're very opposed. Yes, there's a lot of nepotism that goes on inside of unions as well, especially some of the most powerful unions. I am of the mindset always, whenever people say, Hasan, unions are corrupt, what do you have to say to that? I always say, listen, corruption is an inevitability in most power structures. If that is the case, if that is a constant, I would rather have the corrupt entity, the corrupt body, at least in some ways, tangentially represent the interests of the many rather than the interests of the few. A corrupt union is still better than no union. A corrupt union is still better than a corrupt corporation. Personally, understand that corporations are supposed to be corrupt. They can do whatever the fuck they want. That's their starting position. That's their starting formation. Ultimately, within unions, you also have some level of democratic power. Okay, let's continue.
The anger on the streets of France last week. So today, here at the Élysée Palace, Emmanuel Macron will be hosting his Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, and members of his own party, ministers and leading figures in Parliament, to try and look at an action plan to see what they can do to go forward and get out of this crisis, really, in French politics. It's hard, though, to know what their action plan can do to appease France's trade unions and those protest movements who say that they do not intend on backing down. And Emmanuel Macron has signalled in the past that he doesn't want to back down on these pension plans to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. Some are suggesting in the opposition that the plan should be put on hold for maybe 6 months or something to look at ways in which they could be watered down to try and bring people on board. But they're already going through a constitutional process.
Famously, there's no mechanism of like feeding into the retirement pension programs like other than just increasing the age. I mean, even I don't know anything about the French economy. Okay, what do they fucking make baguettes and stuff and cigarettes? They eat cigarettes and make baguettes. That's their entire economy, right? And cheese, yes. Oui, cheese and also escargot. Even I know that here, there's always an endless amount of money supply that you're not fucking taxing. And it's oftentimes corporations and the wealthy. Oh, yeah, I was going to say, of course, before I forget, and manipulate African currency. I mean, the French economy revolves around eating cigarettes, selling baguettes, and manipulating African currency. So there is that, before I forget, of course. Africa has currency. African nations do have currency. Some of their central banks are in France. I wonder why. Macron raised the military spending by 1/3. Maybe they can start with some budget cuts there. Yeah. You know what's funny about that, by the way? He's still getting lapped by the United States of America. Suck my dick, Macron. Stop trying to make fucking nuclear submarines, bitch. That's our shit. And guess what happened, dude? Australia, a bunch of fucking fake friends, said, no, mate, we're not taking your fucking submarines. We're taking the American submarines. Suck my fucking dick. Suck my fucking willy, mate. What happened? What happened to Macron? He said, oh, no. We will leave NATO. How dare you not use our nuclear submarine? How dare you use American nuclear submarine instead? Fuck you. Merde. That's what you said. Stop spending your fucking money on the military. What are you doing? You're not going to fucking, you are not going to colonize Libya, okay? Stop. Focus on your own goddamn country. You're a European social democracy. Leave the imperialism to America. That's literally what they do. That's why we don't have healthcare in this country, because we do the imperialism for you. The entire purpose of living in a fucking European social democracy is like relegating the responsibility of empire to the United States of America, where all of us fat fucking pigs are dying here because we can't have social safety nets because we're spending all of our money on fucking destroying the global south. Stop trying to be America. You are not him. You're not that guy, pal. I mean, but that's literally true, by the way. And it's not just me who says this. Steven Crowder says it all the time. He just thinks it's a positive. I think it's a negative. You know what I mean? Like right-wingers say that all the time. They're like, you have relegated national security at the international level to the United States of America. Why the fuck do you need any military power, dude? What are you going to do? Duke it out with Turkey and Libya? Is that what you want to do? Stupid. Stop.
Already in the Constitutional Council, and basically Emmanuel Macron would just need to sign them off for them to become law. So it's tricky to see what at this stage the president and the government can do to calm the anger of protesters, but that's what they're going to be talking about this afternoon.
Right, and in the meantime, Catherine, the anger is still very prevalent. Protesters have blocked the Louvre Museum today in Paris. The piles of garbage just keep getting bigger, and it's not over yet.
It is not over yet by any means. The Louvre Museum, the world-famous museum, is actually closed right now, blocked determined by the protesting workers there. So anyone who's got tickets, at the moment it looks like that is closed today. There is still litter, garbage lining the streets of Paris, despite government orders.
I love how much they talk about like the negative consequences of the strike. Here's one thing. Hasan Abi rules of media literacy. If your media is not telling you that the strike could be ended by those in power, whether it be the government or those in power in this situation, or the strike could be ended by those who own the means of production, the capital owners, they're lying to you. There's two sides to a strike, always, okay? You have the labor side that's doing the strike, and you have the other side, the capital owning side, that could also end the strike. How could they end that strike? Not by hiring scabs, of course, but by listening to the demands, oftentimes are reasonable demands, by the way, listening to the demands of the striking workers, and turning around and conceding to those demands and offering it to them. That's the whole purpose of a strike. But for some reason, biased-ass media, which, operates as an arm of capital, will oftentimes refuse to mention that part. They never actually talk about that part. They always make it entirely up to the striking workers to just shut the fuck up and get back to work. That's all you're saying. When you talk about how dirty France is, okay, and not as a joke like I like to say, okay, but instead talking about the French sanitation workers not actually cleaning up the streets, when you're talking about how fucking shitty that is, you're doing a disservice. You're not behaving like an honest, objective, truthful media that is supposed to be covering marginalized groups or identities or anything like that. You're talking about it from the perspective of capital owners. Now, the irony, of course, is that this person, Catherine Norris Trent, is a fucking worker. You're working for France 24. You might be a senior reporter, but ultimately you are a worker as well. If your workplace tomorrow decided to fuck you over, you would want a union to defend you. You would want other unions to also engage in an act of solidarity. But because the media has to work as an arm of capital, the only people that get to that position, that get elevated to that position, are dumbass class traders who don't understand their position as workers themselves. We've been conditioned to think that strikers are being lazy and greedy. Exactly. If you want to blame someone for the huge piles of trash, blame the government for literally just bouldering through and refusing to listen to the protesting French workers.
For those refuse workers to come and collect it, it's basically not being cleared, or not on a massive scale yet, because a lot of the waste processing plants, the incinerators around the edge of Paris, some of those are still blocked by strikers too, so it's not able to be gotten off the streets. And there are other blockages in other towns, down in Nice in the south of France. Over the weekend in the west of France, there were extremely violent scenes with environmental protesters standing off against riot police, which is also a sign of this anger that's...
Yeah, who's the violent side in that regard? Potato-ass motherfuckers with, like, riot gear and rubber bullets and trucks that have high-pressure water cannons? Or the fucking, like, gay, anarchist, environmental activists? I wonder who is the truly violent side of this riot. Let's think.
Still simmering here in France. And, of course, tomorrow, the 28th of March, there's a 10th massive day of strikes and protests called across France, and everyone really is bracing for further violent scenes and confrontations there.
Catherine, thank you for that. France 24's Catherine Norris Trent.
Fundraising to help strikers is paying off in France. Money collected during demonstrations and on dozens of donation websites is now above 4 million euros.
I remember a much different coverage over Hong Kong protests. Yeah, because that was what America likes, okay? There's a difference. America hates genuine labor movements, but they also don't like China. That is precisely the reason why, never forget the Hong Kong protests that were against China, against the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. When it was against the Chinese Communist Party, it's great. It's awesome. Because, again, that's where the American bias is. That's where the State Department and its interests lie.
Julien Giquel works for one of the largest strike funds.
2,380,000, a nice sum.
Many of the donations are for small amounts. Among the ones here, a surprise.
3,000. That's a big donation. It's a real pleasure to get that.
The check is the second in a month from the same person. Jean-François Ledizet in Grenoble is now retired after a career as a maths teacher. He has long supported workers' rights.
Long live the strikes. Share wealth, not misery. That's also at stake now.
He has a pension of 1,800 euros a month and sees worker solidarity as a duty.
I cannot strike, so my way of supporting the strike movement is to back it with money. I made 2 donations because I saw the strike was continuing, and if it continues further, I could give again.
This is awesome.
The money goes directly to strikers. These union workers in Versailles have received tens of thousands of euros. At the Montparnasse railway station in Paris, there's money too in the coffers to support the strikers.
It gives the strike momentum. It gives us energy and courage to vote to continue.
Donations appear to have increased since the government used Article 493 of the Constitution to force pension reform through Parliament.
Before we move on, though, France secretly owns 14 countries. Let's take a look.
French treasury. The issue at stake is the apex of French policymaking, the CFA franc. Using it, France controls the monetary sovereignty of 14 nations, making up nearly 200 million.
Remember what I told you? How, this is one of the leading economies of France?
People. These countries include Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, and the Central African Republic. And while these nations have a seat at the United Nations and wave their independent flags, it is only the face of...
I know the super secret 15th, but I'm not telling you. Dude, what the fuck? Tell us. What the fuck, dude? Yo! That's messed up, dude. That's messed up.
Imperialism that has changed. The conduct of business has largely remained the same. The big difference is that imperialism used to be spread through tanks. Nowadays, it comes through banks.
Well, that's just, part and parcel for European neo-colonialism. 15th is Louisiana.
Special thanks to the sponsor of this video, War. The most comprehensive.
Shut the fuck up.
Anyone pack that includes multiple premium vehicles, premium account, boosters, and much more. Anyone can create money.
Now that's fucking targeting right there, dude. That right there, that's some hyper-targeted shit.
The hard part is having others accept it. In pre-colonial times, many African societies used cowrie seashells as a medium of exchange. These seashells were so widely circulated that by 1800 they had an official exchange rate with the French currency. But as the French Empire colonized deeper into Africa, Paris sought to monopolize these circuits of production and trade. Taxes were demanded in francs, and armed troops were sent to markets, forcing merchants to accept French currency. From the 1930s onwards, France came to dominate the money supply in French-speaking Africa. With new power came new extrajudicial perks. Paris gained access to African labor and raw materials at sub-market prices, while finished goods were sold back to Africa at above-market prices. French neo-colonialism was so intrusive, so ruthless, so unique that it earned a name of its own, France-Afrique. Following World War II, however, things changed. Paris joined the Bretton Woods.
Another thing that's suspect is when French racists say they're against this practice, they will oftentimes give the game away, where they are not actually against the practice itself. They're just against the secondary consequence of that, which is immigration into France. They don't like when black people come into France as a consequence of this ongoing exploitation.
System, and as a result, the French franc was devalued to set a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. These fiscal reforms were taking place at a time when Africa was decolonizing itself. A weaker currency only added fuel to the fire. So, to hold on to its African holdings, France conjured a new currency in 1945 called the CFA franc and forced its colonies to adopt it. Initially, the CFA franc was pegged to its French counterpart at a rate of 1.7 to 1, but in 1948 it was increased to 2 to 1. By overvaluing the CFA franc, Paris maintained its economic advantage while crushing Africa's export competitiveness. So in a way, France built its post-war recovery partially to a wealth transfer from Africa. Even so, the most effective forms of control are those that are invisible. Recognizing this in 1958, France hijacked authentic decolonization by installing local collaborators and
Macron calls Russia one of the last imperial colonial powers on Africa visit. France has assassinated 22 African presidents since 1963. Here's a list of African presidents who have been assassinated by France since 1963. Okay, I need to see this list. This list seems a little insane. I don't know if it's 22 seems like 22 seems like a bit of an embellishment. It might be. I think they're giving up a little bit to the CIA. Like they're kind of taking CIA credit a little bit, it seems. Just like when they talk about when they get some of the people that they offer dual citizenship to be French instead of an African nation of origin when they're winning World Cups. But of course, when they're not winning World Cups, then they're immigrants, and not welcome, that kind of thing.
Granting them statehood, these collaborators became the custodians of France's neo-colonial empire by maintaining the Franc zone and French military bases. Only Guinea turned down the offer. Its leader, Sékou Touré, declared that his people preferred being poor in freedom than rich in slavery. Guinea thus rejected the CFA franc, seeking to develop its own currency. France felt it needed to make an example of Guinea, so it cut pensions to war veterans, dismantled Guinea's power grid, and then attempted to block its UN membership. France went as far as to induce hyperinflation by flooding the country with counterfeit bills, all the while funding armed anti-government resistance. Yeah, it got pretty crazy.
America shit.
The plan ultimately failed to dislodge Sékou Touré, but Guinea's economy never fully recovered. Likewise, when Togo had a change of heart and sought to ditch the CFA franc, France made another example, this time without loose ends. Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was assassinated in January 1963. French involvement is suspected, but official records remain conveniently closed. Of itself, further attempts to conceal French imperialism followed. The CFA franc was split into two currencies covering the Central and West African states. By the mid-1970s, their respective central banks were Africanized and moved to Yaoundé and Dakar. Though local Africans staffed these institutions, there were no fundamental policy changes, and France
Stop downplaying European neocolonialism. We literally came up with this shit. True. You are right. I'm just talking to an American audience for the most part. That's why I'm using that example. Does that make sense? Like I'm talking to a lot of Americans who understand this on American terms, which is why I'm explaining it by saying like they're doing America shit.
Retained veto power over
partially because like we kind of perfected it. You know what I mean?
Governing statutes. This included a requirement that member states deposit half their exchange reserves at the French treasury plus another 20% for financial liabilities, meaning member states retained access only to 30% of their money. Moreover, all foreign exchange conversions were to pass through the French treasury. The way this fiscal policy works is by operations accounts. These are special accounts held at the French treasury. The denominations are in euros, but when accounts are in credit, the African central banks effectively place their foreign exchange reserves at France's disposal. But when the central banks' accounts are in debit, they are obligated to pay interest to the French treasury. In other words, CFA.
They're so helpful, dude. I mean, the underpinning of this is like obviously like military action, continued oppression, but the continuation of such debtor capitalist imperialism is basically saying like, oh well, these African nations can't control their own currencies. I mean, we got to do it for them. You know what I mean? And of course, they're going to pay us a little bit of a price for us to be able to do such a thing.
Member states pay France to hold on to their money. Even more unsettling, no one knows what France does with the money. The French treasury does not disclose this information even to CFA franc nations. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary if France were to reinvest African funding for French profit. However, one looks at it, the CFA scheme is an effective moneymaker for France, and French businesses benefit as much as the French treasury. More specifically, France doesn't need to draw on its foreign exchange reserves for African imports. Dozens of French multinationals are present in Africa, including Total Energies, Areva, and Vinci. Africa also grants France access to strategic resources like uranium, which is indispensable for France's nuclear energy sector, meeting 3/4 of French energy needs. Meanwhile, Gabon is a source of crude oil, Mauritania delivers iron ore, while Togo and Benin provide agricultural commodities. Additionally, the icing on the cake, French national Vincent Bolloré owns most of West Africa's major ports. It is thus not by incident that former French President Jacques Chirac once stated that much of the money in French banks comes precisely from exploiting Africa, and that France would lose its global standing without its African empire.
This is why people say Africa is not poor. Africa is not a poor continent. As a matter of fact, it's one of the richest continents. It's just that Africa has been stolen from. That's it. That's what it is. It's just been, they've had their natural resources extracted for a tidy profit that goes directly to European coffers. And by people, I don't know what, play that yellow clip. No, we don't need to do all of that, okay?
To preserve its hegemony, France has intervened militarily on the continent 40 times since the 1960s. From propping up corrupt dictators to conducting military operations in the Sahel. Moreover, the configurations of the CFA franc allow profits and capital to be repatriated with ease. Between 1970 and 2010, Ivory Coast lost $40 billion to capital flight, which could have reduced poverty by 10% annually had it been reinvested domestically. Meanwhile, Equatorial Guinea and Congo, the main oil producers, transferred out the money equivalent of 43% and 30% of their respective GDPs between 2000 and 2009. Similar trends are present in Gabon and Cameroon. Opulence at the top generates misery below. Though advocates point to the CFA franc's stability, a lack of monetary sovereignty restricts the tools available to the CFA member states. For instance, Ivory Coast's inflation rate is below 6% versus 29% in neighboring Ghana, but the latter's extreme poverty rate is only 13% versus 30% of Ivorians. The CFA members.
Bro, people are so mad about France in the chat, and it's so funny because like everyone that's saying this is American, what do you think we do? Like, why do you think I'm so angry all the fucking time as it pertains to U.S. foreign policy? Did you have Paris syndrome when you went to France? No, I like France. I think France is very pretty. I know that that's an unpopular opinion, but from what I understand, Paris syndrome happens to Japanese tourists for the most part who like fantasize about France. They are like big Francophiles in Japan, but then they realize like they're coming from a actually developed nation, like a real developed nation. And then they go to France and they're like, well, it's just like kind of shittier.
States also lag behind other African states growth-wise. Some are even going backwards. Ivory Coast's real GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than in 1978. In 2016, Senegal was at its 1960 level. Meanwhile, Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon have not topped their respective peaks of 1986, 1984, and 1976. This means these countries have had little to no real economic growth in decades. But change.
Japan is more developed than France. That people work 80-hour weeks and only get paid like 60 of those hours. My guy, come on. I mean, I wasn't talking about like labor rights at all, as a matter of fact. I was simply talking about like infrastructure. The reason why I find France to be fun and lovely is because I live in the United States of America, a nation without infrastructure and a nation that has higher hours of wage labor than France and Japan. You're wrong on that front. We have worse labor conditions in the United States of America overall. Our labor conditions are like, you know, less than India, but still incredibly awful. And then also on top of that, we don't have any like decent infrastructure, no city planning, none of that. At least France has that. I see no issue with working more hours, to be honest. Okay, Dodgers lover, have fun with that. Just like you're never working for yourself, you're working for another boss. That's great. I mean, if you don't have issue with working additional hours, then, you know, I guess it's all right then. Never mind. My man loves the Dodgers and he loves the boot, you know? Does he love the top of the hour ad break though? Which comes at the top of every hour? Or does he work extra hours?
Constant in life. In recent years, the societies of the CFA member states have started publicly talking about alternatives. It's a trend that is becoming increasingly louder. The most feasible proposal is to form a regional currency bloc untethered from French control. Some proponents of this plan would use the West African ECOWAS economic union as a springboard. This would reorient the CFA franc member states around Nigeria, which accounts for more than 2/3 of the regional GDP. Plus, Nigeria is a net oil exporter, while most West African states are importers, so there is a natural synergy in the ECOWAS region. Of course, nothing worth having comes easy. Paris has sought to forestall these attempts. A law to this effect was passed in the French Senate in January 2021. It looks to change the West African CFA franc into the ECO and then abolish the operations.
892, thank you for that. Faustini says, every time Hasan talks about colonial imperialism, I want to remind him that the United States is also a colonial project that threw off its imperialist master. We inherited European imperialism. We didn't create it. Also, 4 out of 10. Okay, we inherited it and then perfected it. What the fuck does that mean? Faustini just has to chime in and make it seem like it's not us that's doing this. Like, you got to distance American actions from America for some reason every single time.
Accounts and withdraw French personnel from the central banks. All this is to be completed by 2027, but Paris would still retain effective control. Where the African monetary reserves would be held, at which location remains unaddressed. It's safe to say that the French reform is nothing but a ruse. Ultimately, the best solution may be for the individual states to have their own central banks and currencies fixed to a common regional unit at an adjustable rate. This would give monetary sovereignty to 14 nations, or nearly 200 million people. But many still fear crossing swords with France, and for good reasons. So, any attempts to break away from French hegemony would require a joint effort across the CFA franc zone. Most of all, the African collaborating elites who benefit from the system would need to be sidelined and replaced by lawmakers prepared to embark on a path of self-directed development. This may prove to be the greatest stumbling block, and it's something that has to change from within, because there is nothing more agreeable in life than making peace with the status quo, and yet nothing more corrupting. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report.
Also, we're saying that America does the same thing with 3 extra chefs via IMF and World WTO. They control the monetary policy instead of direct money supply. Yeah.